Kia ora,
Kia ora.
and welcome along to this virtual walk tour from Wellington, New Zealand. My name's Gareth.
And I'm Roger.
And together
Gareth and Roger.
We've been doing these Rainbow LGBTI walk tours since 2017, and it's a real delight to be able to present today this one, which is the Turquoise walk tour, where we'll be starting at Civic Square in the heart of Wellington, and then moving around Lower Cuba Street, Willis Street, and ending up on Lambton Quay.
We should really first begin by welcoming you to Wellington, New Zealand, if you're joining us from overseas. And also just to say on this day, the 16th of January 2022, that we're thinking about people in the Pacific with the underwater volcano which has just gone off there, and the tidal waves and things that have been created because of that. So thoughts with them.
We should also say a thank you to Dr. Alison Laurie and Hugh Young. Quite a lot of the information in this tour is coming from their research that they've done over many years. So really appreciate Alison and Hugh and their willingness to share material as well.
Awesome.
Yep.
Okay.
Should we move to our first stop?
Should we move to our first stop?
Virtually.
Which you will see behind us very shortly.
And we're actually going to be jumping, it's a very short skip away to the Wellington Town Hall on our left and the Michael Fowler Centre on our right.
So the Michael Fowler Centre is a concert hall and convention centre. It's named for Sir Michael Fowler, who was the Mayor of Wellington when the convention centre was being built. Michael Fowler ran against Carmen Rupe in the 1977 mayoral election in Wellington, and he won that. We'll hear a little bit more about Carmen's side of the story a bit later in the tour. But for a couple of years after being made the mayor of Wellington, Fowler caused controversy by vetoing advertising in Wellington buses, which bore the dangerously inflammatory slogan, "Lesbians, contact your local community." That's all it said, and it gave a PO box number where you could contact the newly opened lesbian centre in Wellington. Now, the City Council's Transport Committee rejected the ad so as not to encourage deviations from the norm. Those are the words that they used. Michael Fowler also vetoed the advertising on the grounds that a little boy might happen to ask his mother on the bus what a lesbian was. So this action prompted fairly swift protest both in Wellington and, interestingly, in San Francisco, where Sir Michael was visiting in 1981 in July. He was picketed in San Francisco. But even if he wasn't a Rainbow supporter, his buildings were. Now, he didn't design the Michael Fowler Centre, but he was an architect, and he designed a number of other fairly prominent buildings around Wellington, one of which is the overseas passenger terminal, which is now luxury apartments on Wellington's waterfront. He designed those in the early 1960s. In the 1990s, they were used for numerous devotion dance parties throughout that decade. And then the Michael Fowler Centre itself in 2016 was lit up in the rainbow colours to show solidarity with those killed in the Orlando nightclub massacre that year. And then in March 2018, following a vigil in Civic Square for Zena Campbell, who died in Aro Valley, the mayor of the time, Justin Lester, had the Michael Fowler Centre lit up in the colours of the trans flag, so that's blue, pink and white. And then in March 2019, the Michael Fowler Centre hosted the 40th ILGA World Conference, and that saw hundreds of rainbow delegates from around the world come to Wellington, and it was lit up in, I think, the rainbow colours on that occasion too.
Well, the other building behind us is the Wellington Town Hall, so that's to your left, that old lovely building. And the Wellington Town Hall has been used on numerous occasions for both pro-rainbow events and also anti-rainbow events. And one of those anti-rainbow events took place on the 11th of April 1985. And this was right at the start of the very heated homosexual law reform debate that happened in 85 and 86. This meeting that I'm referring to was, one of the speakers was MP Norman Jones, and there's a photo here of MP Norman Jones. He was a MP for Invercargill, and he was rabidly against homosexual law reform, and he told people in that meeting, there were both mainly anti-reformers in the meeting, but there was also a group of pro-reformers. He told them to go back into the sewers, and he also told the rest of the crowd, turn around and look at them, but don't look too long or you might catch AIDS. Well, Norman was, as I say, quite rabid against homosexual law reform, and he said some horrendous things, like he was saying he wished people that had AIDS, they should die sooner rather than later to help prevent law reform, which is just scandalous now.
Nasty man.
Nasty man. So HIV and AIDS and homosexual law reform are really quite entwined here in New Zealand. HIV, the awareness of HIV and AIDS really started happening kind of 83, 84, 85. Anti-reformers were saying that legalising homosexual acts would legalise the spread of AIDS, and pro-reformers were saying that actually decriminalising homosexual activity would lead to better health outcomes because people could go to their doctor and be honest. So both sides were actually using the law reform, the HIV and AIDS issue as a bit of a thing with law reform.
So to counter some of the venom of Norm Jones, and some of the others too, for that matter, and to reframe what would be reported by the media, activists like Julie Glamuzina and Maxine Wilkinson stood up in the middle of the town hall and began passionately kissing, causing uproar with the conservative audience, but making the nightly news. And there's a great image here, as you can see, from the newspaper the next day.
Yes, although I think the newspaper says two men embrace. In fact, it was two women.
Two women.
And you think the courage to actually get up in a meeting that is so venomous against you, to actually do that is very special.
Well, since we started talking about law reform, we should maybe look a wee bit deeper into it. It was Fran Wild who introduced the Homosexual Law Reform Bill in 1985, but that wasn't the first attempt at law reform in New Zealand. There have been a number of previous law reform attempts in Parliament in the 1970s, preceded by some years of action by community groups seeking equality. In fact, the City Art Gallery building, where we began this tour on Civic Square, and it was once the public library, it was there when it was the library, it hosted the first public meeting of the New Zealand Homosexual Law Reform Society in 1967.
In fact, it's actually the building to your left,
just over my shoulder,
just behind Roger. That's the old City Library, and is now the City Art Gallery.
Yes, yep. That's right. So, Fran Wild's bill was made up of two parts. The first part set out to decriminalise homosexuality between adult consenting males and make it illegal to discriminate against anyone based on their sexual orientation. Well, it took 16 months of heated debate, both within Parliament and out in the public. But finally, the first part of the bill, that which dealt with decriminalising homosexual acts between consenting adults, that was passed on the 9th of July 1986. However, part 2 of the bill, that was the part that dealt with discrimination, was lost. And so you could perfectly legally and quite happily discriminate against people if they were homosexual in a number of areas from that time. You had the backing of the law to do it. And so, Gareth, I wonder if you know what areas those were that you could discriminate.
Certainly accommodation, services, so people could refuse to serve you in a shop, and also employment, so you could be refused employment simply on the grounds of being gay or rainbow.
Pretty scandalous, really. Now, that wasn't changed until 1993 with the passing of the Human Rights Act, which enshrined people's rights not to be discriminated against, and also made it illegal to discriminate against people based on disability.
And also bodily organisms, so like that prevented people being discriminated on the basis of their HIV status. and probably has something to do with things like COVID now. You can't discriminate on the basis of if you've got a virus. Yeah. Moving on to our next stop now, and our next stop is literally just on the other side of the old city library. And just to give you a bit of context, so when it was the city library, running down one side of it was a walk area, and there was a public toilet there, and that went onto Harris Street. And Harris Street is behind us now, and so we're looking at the corner of the new public library, and Harris Street is going behind us, and you can see on the Google map that Harris Street is just going off to our left. And on Harris Street in the mid-70s, this was where the Member of Parliament Colin Moyle was picked up by police. And Colin was a Labour MP, and the library closed at 9 o'clock at night, and yet he was there at 11 o'clock at night. The public toilets next to the public library were a well-known haunt for men seeking sex with men, and certainly not saying that's what Colin was doing, but this was an area where it was known to happen. So it was a cruising area. Anyway, the police picked him up at 11 o'clock on a weeknight and said, "What are you doing here?" And he said that he was waiting for a friend to come out of the library. Unfortunately, the library had closed 2 hours earlier, so that story didn't quite wash. Anyway, there was a little bit of an investigation, and then it went quiet, and until, of course, Prime Minister Robert Muldoon, a year later, brought this scenario up in Parliament. And of course, at the time, homosexual activity was illegal, and it was a really bad thing to say somebody was homosexual or being found to have done homosexual activity. So it certainly wasn't a good thing in some circles, in Parliament, for instance. Anyway, Colin said that nothing happened, but under parliamentary privilege, Robert Muldoon brought this up, and so an inquiry was launched. And unfortunately, I think for Colin, the story kept on changing, and so at one point he said, I think that he was following a cat burglar. At another point, he was saying that he was talking about a spy or finding out information about some other issue. All of this led, in fact, to Colin Moyle's resignation from Parliament, although later on he said he didn't actually need to, but I think it was just so distasteful. What it does point out is this is one of the first times in New Zealand where homosexuality was used as a political weapon, and Prime Minister Robert Muldoon was pretty notorious for doing that kind of thing. It was around the same period that he really started targeting Marilyn Waring, and Marilyn Waring was actually outed by the Truth newspaper in a really nasty way for months. I think the Truth had headlines around Marilyn's private life. But it was just a very interesting example of how politics and homosexuality are really quite tied together.
Absolutely. Well, while we're still at this corner here, we should talk about Carmen Rupe and her nightclub, Le Balcon, the Balcony. We've got an image, I hope, coming up shortly of that. Carmen Rupe was a performer, as well as being an activist, particularly around anti-discrimination and HIV/AIDS. She was also an entrepreneur, here's Carmen, and a brothel keeper. Now, Carmen was born in 1936, growing up in Taumarunui in the central North Island before she relocated to Auckland and then Wellington. She first began drag performance while doing compulsory military service, and then moved to Sydney's King's Cross in the late 1950s and became Australia's first Maori drag performer. And from that time she lived as a woman. Now, she came back to Wellington in 1967 and established this place here, Carmen's International Coffee Lounge and Le Balcon. That's what's the balcony is the place there. It's above the Hurry Up Shoe Repairs, which you can see down the bottom. It was an entertainment establishment catering to mixed audiences, and it could hold about 400 people, so it was a fairly large venue. It was a variety nightclub, which included striptease shows, and according to the late Dana DeMilo, it was never advertised as such, but it was known to many as a transgender revue. We've got a playbill here from one particular night in the 1970s, where you could see the Paris by Night review, which included the Jungle Slave Girl, and you could also see the routines Schoolgirl Expelled, Spider Woman, and Go-Go Fantasia. So you can get a bit of a taste there of the sort of things that you might see if you happen to pop in to the balcony on that particular night. Now, Carmen, as I mentioned earlier, ran for Wellington's mayoralty in 1977. Unsuccessfully, as it turned out. She had the backing, though, of the property magnate Bob Jones, and she had the slogan, "Get in behind." Now, part of her campaign was advocating legalised brothels and gay marriage, so in fact she was well ahead of mainstream society, considering that homosexual acts, as we mentioned before, were illegal up until 1986, and prostitution reform only happened in 2003.
Well, our next stop is just around the corner on Wakefield Street, and I'll just change the background here. And what we're looking at here is on our left, just on the map there, on our left, or the street view I should say, are the council chambers and then the old Wellington Town Hall. And on our right we now have a hotel, the Plaza Hotel. But this was actually the site of the Sun Sauna, and the Sun Sauna was established here in Wellington in the 1960s. And I think from the start it was just a mainstream sauna, but it soon got a name as a meeting place for men who have sex with men, and later it would turn into a full-on sex-on-site venue. In the 1960s, you basically went up the stairs, so I'll just see if I can find, there's a little entranceway just by this red car, and so the Sun Sauna was up the stairs on the first floor to the right hand side. If you went up the stairs and went to the left hand side, you would go into the Scripture Union bookshop. I'm not sure, the kind of strange bedfellows really when you think about it. So you could potentially go to the Scripture Union bookshop to begin with, then go to the sauna, or vice versa. So the sauna was actually raided by the police in the 1980s, early 1980s. They were doing police raids of sex-on-site venues both in Auckland and in Wellington, and that prompted a lot of outrage in the community. They were going into these places and arresting men that they found in there, and there were a number of high-profile high-profile protests. Demonstrations. So outside the Wellington police station, and also in Auckland, where around about 500-600 people marched down Queen Street out of in anger, really. A participant on an earlier walk tour told us that in the 70s and 80s, particularly rainbow people would only use first names, so that actually if a gay person was arrested, they couldn't actually snitch on other gay men because only first names were being used, and that was simply because of that. Yeah.
Should we stroll now to the Rainbow Precinct? You've got the key, so you can drive us there.
Absolutely.
On Street View, and we're going to the heart of what is known as the gay Wellington's Rainbow Precinct, which was championed by the then Mayor Justin Lester. And we're heading to the there we go, the Rainbow Crossing.
Ta-da.
Rainbow Crossing, which was the second Rainbow Crossing, in fact, launched in New Zealand. That one was put down in was painted in October 2018 to honour Carmen Rupe's birthday.
That's right, and actually if we just, Roger and I will just part, that is the very newly painted Rainbow Crossing. that was painted just a week ago, and so it's looking a lot fresher than if you look at the one on Google Street View. It looks a wee bit kind of faded, shall we say. But this whole area is a fantastic rainbow precinct, and it's interesting, for this particular crossing, the Transport Authority and also the police objected to it. The Transport Authority said, quote, it was going to create there is a high risk of confusion and a dazzling and distracting effect.
Well, you can tell, can't you? Dazzles.
But anyway, it was successfully painted. In fact, it was painted in part by Mayor Justin Lester, which was really fantastic to see.
Now, I mentioned there are a couple of other rainbow crossings around New Zealand. The first one was in Queenstown. There's a very cute one which is chalked in Paekakariki every year for the Pride celebrations they have up there. And there's just been a new one painted in Gisborne.
Gisborne, right? Yes, yep. So no, they are spreading.
Popping up everywhere.
They're spreading. Yep.
All right. Well, while we're here and looking in this direction, or while you're looking in this direction, while you're looking in our direction, we've got our backs to the building on the corner here. Let's talk about Mary Taylor.
So the building's on the left-hand side.
Behind me, yep. So in 1849, Mary Taylor established a drapery store in the building on the site behind me. And she made that store, there we go, there's the store, with her cousin Ellen Taylor. And Mary had come out from England in 1845 when the population of Wellington was only 4,000 people. Now, Mary was the lover, some say, of the famous English writer Charlotte Bronte.
And we should say this image that we're currently looking at is Mary Taylor.
It's Mary, not Charlotte.
And here's Charlotte.
Yep. Now, Charlotte wrote that Mary had more energy and power in her nature than any 10 men. Now, Mary met Charlotte in 1831 when they were at school together, and Bronte was a fairly regular visitor to the Taylors' home in England. Now, she described the Taylor family's company as one of the most rousing pleasures I have ever known. Well, Bronte died in childbirth in 1855 without seeing Mary again. And in 1859, unable to find anyone out here in Wellington that she had anything in common with, Mary decided to return to England, selling her store to her assistant, who then sold it on to James Smith. Now, Mary was a staunch believer that women should be allowed to work for money in order to guarantee their independence and not be bound by convention that they simply got married and had to look after their children and husband and unable to survive independently. And it's worth remembering too that in the 14 years that Mary was in New Zealand, she would have experienced 3 major earthquakes. There was a magnitude 6 Wellington earthquake in 1846. There was a 7.4 magnitude earthquake in Marlborough in 1848. And then, the biggest of them all, there was a Wairarapa 8.2 magnitude earthquake in 1855. So I guess that's maybe another reason why she wanted to leave town. Too shaky.
Yep. Well, there are a number of other locations. Just literally, if we just turn around, so in Google Street View, I'm just turning around. So that's Cuba Street going up Cuba Mall. And here we have the Oaks Complex. And the Oaks Complex was built in the late 1970s. If we had been there before, like in 1978, we would have seen this wonderful building. This is the Royal Oak Hotel, and for many years the Royal Oak had a number of bars that were very, very open to Rainbow LGBTI people, and a whole range of different people. It was known as a real meeting spot, and this was torn down in, I think, 1978, and the Oaks Complex was established. And even in the Oaks Complex, there were a number of different bars as well, which is, I think that's kind of, that's no longer the case, is it?
No, no, it's not. And they catered for different crowds, different clientele.
Yep.
If we also spin around a bit further, with the street view there, we'll be able to see the location for Alfie's nightclub in Wellington. Now, following on from the success of Alfie's in Auckland, Brett Shepherd and Tony Katovich from the Out Business Empire opened Alfie's here in Wellington. Now, at various times from the 1970s on, Out ran Rainbow bars, saunas, bookstores in Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch. They published the Out magazine, and they ran a mail order business and a travel agency. Now, the great benefit of places like Alfie's was that if you wanted to pop in and have a drink amongst kindred spirits, you could do it because it had a full alcohol license, and you could just walk in off the street. At earlier times, though, in private clubs like the Dorian Society, you needed to be a member or be invited by a member to get in.
We're moving now up onto Willis Street, so I've just moved us up there, and we're actually just going down Willis Street, fingers crossed, and we're heading, oh gosh, yep, we're heading to the Willis Street village. And this was the site, this was one of the later sites of the Dorian Society.
Yes, so the Dorian Society was established in 1962, and it was in the Willis Street village here from about 1980 through until it closed in 1988. It was the first New Zealand organisation for homosexual men, although homosexuality wasn't mentioned in the club notes or the club rules. Its stated objective was to promote among its members an honest desire to serve the development of friendship, mutual respect and tolerance in all its aspects. It was primarily a private social club that avoided political action, but in 1963 it took the first steps in New Zealand towards law reform by forming a legal subcommittee which collected books and other resources towards the aim of law reform. Now, this led to the formation of the New Zealand Homosexual Law Reform Society in the late 1960s. The Dorian had a number of locations around Wellington, including on Lambton Quay by Cable Car Lane, and it had an all-male policy for some time, which meant that lesbians couldn't be accepted as members or even as guests at the beginning. But by the time it was here at the Willis Street Village, it was open to all.
We're just going to move down a little bit further down Willis Street now, and we're heading towards this intersection of Manners and Willis Street, and we're going to be talking about a few things here. I'll just see if we can bring this up. We've got the Pollen House, which is actually behind us, and then we're going to be talking about some stuff on Walcott Street. And just to give you an idea, this is Manners Street here. We've got Parrott's Corner, and then the wonderful St. George Hotel, which is very tall. And then on Walcott Street, we have got St. Mary's on the left, and on the right, we've now got the Majestic Centre. And the Majestic Centre used to be the location of the Pollen House, this wonderful wooden house behind us, but in the 80s, it was moved down onto the corner. In its original place, it had 6 Walcott Street next to it, and that was basically opposite St Mary's Church. And 6 Walcott Street was a hive of activity in the 70s and 80s for rainbow community activists. There were multiple organisations that were housed there, including the Women's Resource Centre, the Hecate Women's Health Collective, the Lesbian, Gay and Rights Resource Centre, and the Gay Switchboard. And the Gay Switchboard was the first of its kind, well, certainly in Wellington. I'm not sure about Auckland or the rest of the country, but certainly in Wellington, the Gay Switchboard was established in the 1970s as a way of gay people connecting with each other. Because remember, this is at a time when there wasn't the internet, there weren't smartphones, and so it was very hard to meet people. And so the Gay Switchboard offered kind of support and counselling and just finding out what was going on, where to meet people, that kind of thing. The Lesbian Centre was on the 3rd floor, and this was the first of its kind anywhere in New Zealand, and it was set up in November 1980. And also in that building was the Lesbian and Gay Rights Resource Centre. And this was set up in the late 1970s. And it was there to bring together information around kind of legal aspects of rainbow life, and also health aspects, and just kind of as a central point to kind of gather material and to conduct kind of activist activities. And there's a lovely photo here. I'll just see if I can find for us. This is the Lesbian and Gay Rights Resource Centre in around about 1984, maybe 1985, and I think they're holding a copy of the Pink Triangle. And these photographs, a lot of these photographs from the mid-80s come from David Hinley, who is in the centre of this picture, in the right in the centre. And David was documenting a lot of rainbow activities around homosexual law reform and other aspects of rainbow life. And these photographs are invaluable, and he's very generous in terms of allowing them to be shown and used in a whole range of different kind of areas. So the Lesbian and Gay Rights Resource Centre was, as I say, a real focal point for activists, but it was also a focal point for haters, and the centre was firebombed twice. The second time it was firebombed or arsoned was in September 1986. So this is after homosexual law reform was passed, and there are some images here. I'll just move this along a wee bit. This is Phil Parkinson looking through some of the remnants of what the centre was. And before the arsonists left, they twinked this message. So we're very we get a bit of a clear idea of how they're feeling. I'm just going to cough, so I'm just going to mute this for a minute. That's better.
And I'll just take over. So if we go back to us, and the house behind us is the house of Dr. Henry Pollen and his family, which included his daughter Effie. Now, it was built in 1902, and as Gareth said, was originally located just a little bit further up the street. Effie was born in 1879, and she's mainly remembered these days for her long-term relationship with the New Zealand poet Ursula Bethel, and their relationship lasted for over 30 years. Here's Bethel now, that's right, with Kat in Christchurch. Now, they met in London in 1905, and they lived overseas for many years and didn't return to live in New Zealand until they were in their 40s. When Pollen returned to New Zealand, Bethel followed, and the two women lived together from 1919 in Christchurch. Although sadly, the story goes that when they travelled in public, on buses or trams and things, they were careful to sit separately. They didn't want to arouse suspicion as two women living together. Effie kept house and supported Ursula so that she could write, and Bethel wrote most of her poetry during this period, describing their home, their garden and their life together. Bethel called Pollen her little raven. Well, a few days after Bethel's 60th birthday in 1934, Pollen complained of severe headaches. She went to bed and died there, sadly, 3 weeks later from a brain hemorrhage. And here's her grave. Yeah, that's the grave of the Pollen family. So there's Dr. Pollen, father, I think mother's there. Can you see?
Yes, yep.
And that's only, actually, I think it might be Dr. Pollen's mother. I don't know whether that's his wife.
And Effie is just to the left, on the stone left, yeah. And this is at Karori Cemetery.
Yeah, no, it's great sort of a great grave, if you can call it that. So the distraught Bethel wrote openly of her grief for Pollen in letters, and in the 6 memorial poems that she composed on the anniversaries of Pollen's death. The 6th and final poem, called Spring 1940, she asks God to match spring with vision, spirit of beauty, bring with your persuasive love to the inward eye awakening, lest looking at this life to count what time has taken, I cannot bear the pain. So, very sad.
And Effie's grave is actually quite easy to find. It's not that far off one of the main roots in Karori Cemetery. It's quite nice to go
That's
and
right.
visit.
And that building you could see in the background was the chapel at the cemetery.
And Ursula is buried in North Canterbury. Yeah. Well, we're going to move now to our next stop, which is a little way down Lambton Quay, and I'm just going to do the Google Street View because I feel that we're not really going there if we're not really going there. So
Drive down Willis.
if we were walking this would take around about 7 minutes. But with the technology, I feel that we're already here. So we're on Lambton Quay now. And what we're actually looking at are these two buildings in front of us here. And again, I'm just going to mute because I've got a bit of a tickle in my throat. Just one moment, thanks.
Just talk amongst yourselves.
Oh, that's better. I think that's better. I'll just have a glass of water as well.
So what we're looking at here is 1870s Wellington, isn't it, really? Lambton
Yes.
Quay.
So this is a shot of Lambton Quay from... let me just see if we can find it. Oh, gosh. All a bit flustered now. Let me just put our background onto the background that we want. And let's also just do Google Street View and interact. So if we were standing in this location here, we've got Starbucks coming up on our left. We've got these two buildings, and we're actually looking at this Bend On lingerie shop. And actually, when you go back to the image, that shop is actually on the far right of this image from the 1870s. So we've got a number of buildings in the 1870s. The church on the left is actually St Andrew's on the Terrace. It's actually, well, it's St Andrew's on Lambton Quay at that stage, moved to the Terrace. Then we've got the Supreme Court, and then we would have that Bend On building, which would be to the far right, which is off the screen. That Bend On building used to have Henry Britton's pharmacy, and Henry Britton was a pharmacist that had he had come down from Auckland, had a pharmacy on Lambton Quay, but also on Manners Street. And if we had gone there in the 1870s, we would have probably come across... That's right, yes. We would have probably come across a young Robert Gant. And Robert Gant had come out from the United Kingdom and was training to be a pharmacist. One of the benefits of being a pharmacist was that he could do his own photography. He could process his own photography. I was going to say film, but I don't think it would have been film at the time. I'm guessing it would have been glass plates. So Robert not only was a photographer, but he was also a thespian, and he did a lot of female impersonation. And I will just bring up the image of Robert. So this is an image of Robert as Cecil Riverton. That was the female impersonator name that Robert used. And the Evening Post declared Cecil as achieving, quote, a pronounced success in the part of Little Buttercup in the 1881 production of HMS Pinafore. And so Cecil did quite a number of productions and was very well known in the kind of Wellington area. Probably more so nowadays, Robert's known for the photography that he did. So he moved to Masterton in the 1880s and began photographing. And he would take images like this. This is Robert's actually in the middle of this image, and this is shot in Masterton in the 1880s. And this one here, where Robert's the one being kissed without the hat. And so it's remarkable to think that this is rural New Zealand, 1880s, 1890s. It's remarkable that these images were taken and that they have survived. This is one of Robert taking a photograph of Charlie Hay, and Charlie Hay was the son of the Greytown butcher. And not only did Robert photograph Charlie, but they had a relationship together. In fact, a very long relationship. They had at least 3 decades together. So they moved back to Wellington in the early part of the 1900s, and they had a house in Seatoun. And Charlie was a window dresser at the DIC here on Lambton Quay. And they had home together for 30 years. When Robert died, those images were passed on to Charlie, and then when Charlie passed away, the family deposited them with the Alexander Turnbull Library, and there are 2 albums of those images that have survived, which is really remarkable. We've heard some horror stories of families that come in and completely destroy people's estates because they didn't want to be known as rainbow related. And fortunately in this case that didn't happen.
And in fact, if you want to find out more about Robert Gant and see more of the images, you can get Chris Brickell's book from 2012 called Manly Affections. Well, while we're here on Lambton Quay, we could talk about other things that have happened here. In August 2004, for example, members of Destiny Church marched along Willow Street and into Lambton Quay here on their way to Parliament grounds for their Enough is Enough rally. Now, they were campaigning for a return to what they considered to be Christian moral values in New Zealand society, particularly with regard to the sanctity of marriage between a man and a woman. Well, actually, they put it a husband and a wife. Now, the rally attracted 7,000 protesters, so it was a lot of people, and also a lot of criticism, though, because many of the protesters were wearing black T-shirts and black pants, prompting comparisons with Nazi stormtroopers. In fact, I think there's an image you have there, or maybe you don't have an image.
No, I think we've done that image.
We've done that image. Oh, okay. On the 1st of June, at a Destiny event called Love is Greater Than Hate, Bishop Brian Tamaki, before thousands of followers, apologised for years and years of offensive remarks about gay people. Referring to the Enough is Enough march, he said that if he had another chance, well, we'd do some things differently. It's never been my intent to cause hurt or harm. Well, believe that, if you will.
And he doesn't actually say what things he would have done differently. Would he have made it bigger, better? I mean, yeah. One of the people that was protesting Destiny Church was the icon Georgina Beyer, and there's a lovely photo here of Georgina. This is Georgina wearing the mayoral chain of the Carterton district, and so Georgina was mayor 1995 to 1998. And this was really significant not only for New Zealand but the whole world. Georgina became the first openly transgender mayor anywhere in the world, which was highly significant. And then Georgina moved on to national politics, and in 1999 became the first openly transgender member of parliament anywhere in the world. Again, highly significant. Georgina was born in Wellington. She moved to Auckland with some of her family, came back down to Wellington in the 1970s, and then had multiple kind of careers. But while in Parliament, she really advocated for civil unions. She advocated and saw pass prostitution law reform, also with civil unions that passed as well. And she also put forward gender identity legislation, and unfortunately that was shelved because I think there was so much going on at the time. It happened around the same time as civil unions, and I think they got a legal opinion from Crown Law saying that gender identification was covered under the Human Rights Act, even though it wasn't explicitly stated. But work is still being done on that to actually explicitly put that into the Human Rights Act of 1993.
Well, moving on from civil unions to marriage equality, which was became legal in same-sex marriage became legal in August 2012. There was another march along Lambton Quay, the March for Marriage Equality, and this time the march from Civic Square down Willow Street to Lambton Quay to Parliament in support of marriage equality.
And like right from the get-go, there was young people's energy was really evident. So all of the political parties in Parliament at the time, all of their youth wings came out in support of marriage equality, which was quite different from maybe, 10, 15, 20 years ago. There were also groups like Legalise Love, the Campaign for Marriage Equality, and the Queer Avengers. So the Queer Avengers was a Wellington-based group that was set up in 2010, 2011. There were quite a lot of queer-phobic attacks in Wellington around that time. And so this group was established to basically stand up against that. And they did that really successfully. And then they've also looked at wider issues. So they submitted to Parliament on marriage equality, and part of their submission was, quote, the Queer Avengers support the marriage equality bill. The proposed bill will alter a statute that currently discriminates against queer communities. Laws should be free of discrimination. But then the submission went on, however, the passing of this bill will not end the fight for equal rights and an end to forms of discrimination that still exist for queer communities. So we're talking about things like higher suicide rates, poor or lack of access to healthcare, particularly around trans non-binary communities, adoption laws, and also medically unnecessary surgeries for intersex children. And so I think it was a very strong point they made that yes, marriage equality is great, but actually it's not the end of it. There is still a lot of work to be done.
Over to me. Relatively speaking, the legislation for same-sex marriage passed very smoothly in New Zealand with cross-party support and endorsement from the Prime Minister, John Key. And it passed 77 votes to 44, which was significantly better than civil unions, which was a much closer vote of 49 votes to 44. Moving on to Neil Costello now, and activism taking many forms on the streets. Neil Costello in the mid-1980s is depicted here in this photo. It was taken by David Handley and was taken to highlight an increase in queer bashings during homosexual law reform in the 1980s. Now Neil does a lot of design work for Rainbow events at the time here, and he's also heavily involved in campaigning for law reform. He's also doing direct individual actions like simply standing on Lambton Quay in the middle of rush hour having a long passionate kiss with his boyfriend. Now, shortly after the passing of homosexual law reform, Neil travelled overseas and sadly died in London 4 years later from AIDS-related complications. Now, according to his sister, he didn't want to get tested for HIV as, at the time, there were few treatment options available, and so he was only in hospital for a short time before he died. He's remembered here on the New Zealand AIDS Memorial Quilt, which is now cared for by Te Papa, the National Museum.
We're going to move to our last stop now, which is just a little bit further down Lambton Quay. In fact, we're going to Midland Park, and I'm just going to Google Street View it just so we can keep on. I feel like we're walking down. Lovely day in Wellington. Always a lovely day in Wellington. And a little bit further. Oh, a little bit further. And here we have Midland Park. And Midland Park is on the site of what was the Midland Hotel. And it's a lovely park in the centre of Lambton Quay. On the left-hand side of Midland Park, we have got this wonderful sculpture behind us about Catherine Mansfield. And I think I've got a better shot here. And so this was done by Virginia King, Auckland sculptor. And it's called Woman of Words. And it really does commemorate the life of Catherine Mansfield. So Catherine was born in Wellington in 1888, and spent her early childhood here in Wellington, and then moved to the United Kingdom when she was 19, and she became friends with writers D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf. And there's a lovely photo here I'll just find of Catherine. I'm not quite sure when this was taken, but it's a very lovely photo. While in London, she frequented the Cave of the Golden Calf, and it was described as a decadent nightclub where the cult of Oscar Wilde could continue to worship. In 1917, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and she died at the age of 34 in 1923. So her 100th anniversary is coming up next year. Mansfield has well-documented relationships with both men and women. Her first same-sex romantic relationship was with Mata Mahupoku, and there's a lovely image here of Mata. So they were both at school together in Wellington, and Mansfield wrote in her diary, "I want Mata. I want her as I have had her, terribly. This is unclean, I know, but true."
Well, the second relationship that we know of is with Edith Kathleen Bendel. Now, Mansfield wrote and posted letters in violet ink nightly to Edith, inviting her to stay alone with her at the family batch across the bay in Days Bay. Mansfield wrote in her journal, "Last night I spent in her arms, and tonight I hate her," which being interpreted means that I adore her, that I cannot lie in my bed and not feel the magic of her body. I feel more powerfully all those so-termed sexual impulses with her than I have with any man. Well, on that note, we can end this tour, and there's another fabulous quote from Catherine Mansfield from almost 100 years ago. She wrote it on her birthday in 1922. Only a few months before her death. The quote is, risk anything, care no more for the opinions of others, for those voices. Do the hardest thing on earth for you. Act for yourself. Face the truth."
That's a great quote.
It's a great quote.
Yep.
Words to live by.
And so that's 100 years this year, isn't it, that she did that quote. Yeah, that quote is actually on the sculpture.
It's on her shoulder. It's on her left shoulder. If you look there, you can see those words.
Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on this walk tour. We've really enjoyed presenting it to you. Thanks again to Dr. Alison Laurie and Hugh Young for allowing us to use some of their research. It's really it's inspirational when people offer up research for free and make it available to other people.
Absolutely.
Yep. We've got another walk tour coming up on Sunday the 6th of February, and so you're more than welcome to join us for that. Again, it will be a virtual walk tour, and it will be the obviously same channel on YouTube, and you're more than welcome to join us. Thank you so much for watching.
Please do join us. Thank you.
And we will catch you in a couple of weeks' time.
Ka kite.
Ka kite.